My name is Davor Jalto. I'm director of the master's program in peace studies here at the American University of Rome. And I would like to welcome you all to this event, which is organized in cooperation with the Euro-Gulf Information Center, also here from Rome. Let me just tell you a couple of words about our peace studies program here, its focuses and its mission. We are dedicated to educating future leaders in the field of peace studies with a particular focus on religion and the role of religion and religious institutions as a factor of both peace and conflict. And we expect our students to be future leaders both as scholars and as professionals. As part of that mission, we have established this Peace Studies lecture series, and I'm happy that today with us is a member of the European Parliament, Anders Vistisen, who will talk as the first speaker within our Peace Studies lecture series. The topic is a very relevant one. He is more than equipped with knowledge and experience to talk about this topic, but before we introduce our speaker today properly, I would like to introduce the head, president of the Euro-Gulf Information Center, Dr. Mitchell Belfer, who has been a trustworthy partner and friend for already a couple of years, to actually say something about the Euro-Gulf Information Center and also introduce our speaker. Please.
So first, thank you very much, Professor Jalto. Yeah, it's true. I mean, 1 year ago we were talking, we just mentioned it outside, we were talking in our office on the Via Gregoriana, we were talking about this peace studies program, and now it's remarkable that within 1 year to see not only that it's become an actual program, but to see people who are interested in studying it. I mean, peace studies it's quite an interesting topic because, of course, there's no such thing as peace if there's no such thing as war. And we're facing a time of international crises, one after the other, and very sadly we lose track of the conflict part of the equation and what the root causes of the conflicts are, and we just want to fast forward ourselves to the peace. And of course peace is in everybody's interest, but how we achieve those peace, or that peace, or those pieces in plural, you know, is always the matter of contention. So if we don't solve the conflicts from today, we're going to face them later on down the road. And I think that we're very lucky and very fortunate, not only here in your university, to have a center of peace studies that's going to be looking, you know, a department of peace studies. It's much more than a center. That's going to be looking at not only the crises that lead to conflict and finding ways to uproot them, but you're also going to be, you know, engaging in, I think, very in-depth debates. And this is, you know, very, I think, quite a fitting and important topic to begin with. You know, discussing Saudi Arabia, Iran, the future of international security in the Middle East, because the Middle East, you know, however much we want to close the door on the trends of the Middle East and the Gulf, we can't. There's no such thing as being in splendid isolation. We have to learn how to deal with it. Deal with it in a way that suits us in Europe, but also in a way that's respectful of the countries in those regions. And it's not going to be just an easy, you know, 1-2 step. And that's why I think we're very lucky to have MEP Anders Vistisen, who's here. He's very active in the areas of foreign affairs. He's very active in the area of the Middle East. A very good friend, and we've done work in the past, and I very much hope to do work again, you know, into the future. But I think for me, as the president of Euro-Gulf Information Center, it's through these kind of contacts and this kind of engagement that we have both with the academia as well as with policy makers and decision makers that allows us and gives us life. Because, you know, what do they say? In theory, there is no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there is. And for us, and in our world, it's very true. If you have never actually, you know, if you study terrorism, but you've never, you know, I'm sorry to say it, I mean, nobody wants to experience a terrorist attack. But even to talk to people who have, or to get the experience of countries that deal with it very often, actually it just becomes a textbook question. So we're lucky to have Mr. Vistisen here, who both bridges that gap on the intellectual treatments of the subject, but also the practical treatment. And so I think the topics that we deal with in our center are really mirrored and in the topics that are being dealt with today. So I won't really give much more of an introduction than that, and to engage with Mr. Vistisen, I'm sure that this will give you food for thought. And so please, Mr. Vistisen, if you would take your seat.
Thank you very much, Mitchell. And I'll say it's very hard for me to live up to all these words of prayer already now, but I'll try to do my best. I'm a Danish MEP representing, of course, the constituency of Denmark, quite logically. But other than that, I represent the European Conservatives and Reformist group in the European Parliament, the third largest one. And for them, I serve as the first vice chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, but also as the coordinator in the Special Committee on Terrorism. So I'll try sort of to use that outlook. And I have learned in recent years that there's two things you have to add in the title for people to show up, either Brexit or Trump. So this time we slashed in Trump just to get a little bit of, spark a little bit of debate. But I think the way I will structure this is I will try to do something that is impossible for politicians, to keep it relatively short, to leave time for your questions. I'll probably fail, but I'll do my very best. And I will start just trying to give you an outlook on my take on the region itself, and then go to a geopolitical level and look a little bit about what is the European Union's role and what is the American role sort of into the region. And hopefully from there we can do some questions, and I can pretend I have some answers for you. Otherwise I'll make them up, and then we see where we end up in an hour's time. So that's the game plan of today. But first of all, you can say, why do we spend that much time engaging on the Middle East? Sort of, if we're looking at the world as a whole, it's not a particular populous region. There's a lot of areas in the world where many more people are living. There's a lot of much larger countries. So why does this area spark a particular interest, both from the American side and from the European side? There's probably a multitude of reasons behind that. Some of them are probably that, to a certain extent, we created the mess. We divided the Middle East up after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Not we, as in the Danes, but the French. The French and the British colleagues sort of kept that in their remit. Probably also because of the natural resources, at least historically speaking. Now America is sort of regaining a gas and oil empire and starting to produce a lot more. But if you go back to the 60s and the 70s, this was the sort of entire energy hub of the world for natural resources. And thirdly, I think also because of the direct impact in our societies, especially with the terrorist attacks that we have seen both in America and in Europe, and that at least have sort of an ideologically offspring to the Middle East oftentimes. So I think that's three of the major reasons why we spend so much time engaging with this region, both in the USA and Canada and in Europe as such. And where are we sort of beginning from when we're talking about the Middle East? I primarily work with the Middle East and Northern Africa. And when we're looking at the Middle East, we are seeing a couple of countries that were created out of sort of the British influence, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and the sort of wider Gulf region. And then we are seeing the countries that were more sort of linearly carved up after the First World War. We are talking about, of course, about Israel-Palestine. We're talking about Jordan to a certain extent. We're talking about Iraq. We are talking about, to a certain extent, Syria and Lebanon. And what characterized the later of this category of countries is that for the most part they don't really live up to at least the European notion of a national state. They have highly artificial borders. They are not logically drawn from wars or ethnical affiliation or religious affiliation. We are seeing sort of a puzzle of different ethnicities, religious affiliations, and sometimes even a multitude of that, Shias of Arab descent, Shias of Persian descent, and so on and so forth. So we are seeing countries that, at least at the state of time we're in right now, more or less all to a certain degree are failed states. Failed states that doesn't have a strong central power, that doesn't really work or function as a state anymore. Especially after our intervention in Iraq and the civil war in Syria, the civil war in Lebanon. The only sort of real homogeneous national state we can talk about in the region of the Western Middle East is probably Jordan, and with the Kingdom of Jordan. And then, of course, we have Israel as a Jewish homeland, but that is a different kind of fish. It's a unique country that I love very much, but maybe it's not so relevant for this discussion about our policy in the Middle East. Of course, it is relevant. Israel is always relevant to the Middle East, but it's not the focus of attention I will give here. So we are having now a situation, unfortunately, where we are not really having stable forms of government in either of these countries, and at the same time we are having two dominant, we're having a lot of regional powers who would like to dominate the region, but the most adverse of them would probably be Saudi Arabia and Iran, which eats their agenda. Iran coming after the Iranian Revolution with a very sort of Islamistic version of Shia Islam, but at the same time linked in to a lot of Sunni extremist groups in the region. I talked about Hezbollah, Hamas, and all of these sort of different affiliations in the region. Also other places in the world, in Europe and North Africa, but let's leave that aside. And then on the other side you have the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia with their close allies, where you had this rise of Salafism coming up after the war. And to a certain extent, I think we can define the sort of ideology fight between those two nations as a sort of religious arm race. They always sort of try to inherit, in their own opinion, the true version of Islam, and also to a certain extent, up to a certain period of time, to promote their more or less extreme version of Muslim ideology. And that's not to say that in no way that all Muslims are extremists, not at all. It's just to say that when we're looking at the inspiration for the most extreme element of the Islamic faith, they can normally either be traced back to the origin of the Islamic Revolution or to the sort of more Salafist-inspired thinking of sort of sprung out of primarily Saudi Arabia, but also some of the other countries in the Gulf region. And that has created an extremely unfortunate situation, of course, both in the region, but also in the world as we live in today. I think when we are looking at the terrorist organizations that we're dealing with of Islamic roots, they are drawing a lot on the inspiration from one or both of these extreme tendencies. And it's actually a paradox that if, for instance, look at radicalized environments here in Europe, oftentimes they don't distinguish that much. They are quite more flexible for radicalized people. They can go to one way or the other, or they can sometimes petition both for instance, economical funding, which we have seen examples of in, for instance, my own country of Denmark, where we have seen a relatively small Muslim community, and since it's so small, they are able to actually petition both sides for funding and for scholars and so on and so forth, which is a bit remarkable when we're seeing about how adverse they are in the region itself. But we are in a situation where these two countries are sort of trying to assert themselves into the role as the regional power that sort of define the Middle East. Of course, you have Egypt to the other side, but it's quite a weak state at the moment as a military dictatorship and is not in a very good place. I think they have enough going on just to try to stabilize their own country. And then you have Turkey, which is adding an entire other dimension, but we will leave that being for otherwise we're going to get, it's going to be even more complicated than initially thought. And that is also what we're seeing when we're sort of going into the different conflicts that is going on right now in the Middle East. We are seeing a war in Yemen, a war where the Saudis are trying to help what they see as the legitimate government of Yemen, and the Iranians are trying to sponsor the opposition that has sort of started to begin to take over Yemen, and now is starting to sort of be drawn back in Yemen. We see it in Syria, where we of course have Russian actors, we have Turkish actors, but what we also very predominantly have is groups, and we have Daesh or ISIS. But what we also very predominantly have is forces that are supported by the Saudis, and forces very predominantly directly sponsored by the Iranians. So you can say there is actually proxy wars going on in almost all of the conflict areas. We saw a little bit the same in Lebanon recently, where the Lebanese President or Prime Minister, now Mitchell has to help me, but anyway, Prime Minister, yes, actually went to Saudi Arabia and the Saudis proclaimed that they would protect his right to return. And at the same time, we see Hezbollah being more or less the dominating factor in today's Lebanon, and have taken more or less control over the de facto control over the southern part of Lebanon. So in this situation where we are in all these sort of, I would sort of quite rudely as a European call them more or less failed states, we are seeing these actors sort of in an infight to gain control. That have created a quite extraordinary situation that we have been able to detect in the last 2, 3, 4 years, and that I have tried to follow with some interest. Namely, the situation where the Sunni Gulf states, headed by Saudi Arabia, are starting a reapproachment or realignment with Israel, which was quite unconceivable if we go back 20 or 30 years. But it seems like more and more Israel and the Gulf Sunni states see themselves as de facto allied powers in the Middle Eastern conflict. We are seeing it in Syria, where we know that Israel is taking a very tough stand on Iranian influence. We are also seeing it on a question like Qatar and the freezing of Qatar from the other GCC countries for their activities in promoting terrorism. So this is quite unique sort of geopolitical development that I don't think many have sort of taken very clear notice of as of yet, but where we potentially see a complete de-escalation of what have been almost half a century conflict between the Arab world, the wider Arab world, and the State of Israel. And it has actually come to the point where we have had in the European Parliament now panels officially approved by both governments, where we have had people sit in the same panel from Saudi Arabia and the State of Israel. Not at this point officials yet, but we have had also officials in the same room from both embassies. And that is a very interesting sort of new development in the region, that the sort of division between Iran and the Sunni Gulf states have now become so drastic and so clear that we are actually seeing an alignment with the State of Israel. On the other side, we are seeing Turkey being more and more isolated in the world after Erdogan have sort of moved the country in a more and more authoritarian direction. We have then seen Turkey align themselves more and more with Iran when they have a shared interest, for instance in Syria. So there is some tectonic shifts going on in the Middle East that is very interesting to follow in these years, and we don't know if they will hold, we don't know how robust they are, but we can see that at least for the first time in many years there is actually sort of a realignment. I would say it's probably the most significant development in Israel-Arab relations since Jordan and Egypt made a peace deal with the State of Israel and secured the border situation between the respective nations. So where does that put us here in Europe and in America? The Americans and the Europeans have always, to a certain extent in modern history, had a different outlook on the Middle East. The Americans' traditional ally in the Middle East have been Israel, number one, of course, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. Europe has, to a large degree, I would say, sort of been more open to, for instance, a country like Iran. because you don't have the same dividing lines over Iran in Europe at large as you do in the US. And that's a very interesting, and at the same time, for instance, a question like Turkish membership of the European Union have been hugely controversial in the European Union member states, at least in some of them. And it's sort of been a well-known fact that the Americans have been the one really pushing the European Union also to sort of keep negotiating with Turkey on a potential Turkish membership in the future of the European Union. So normally when I go to America, I start out saying, I accept that the Europeans sometimes have been a little bit naive when it comes to Iran, if you accept that you have been a little bit naive when it comes to Turkey. Sometimes they oftentimes agree with me in the first part, but they don't really want to admit to the Turkey part. But anyway, it's quite interesting to see that where Europe has sort of decided, what the part of the world where Europe has decided to test the thesis that we have an independent foreign affairs policy that is independent from the American one, has to a very large degree been in the Middle East. That is probably the place in the world where you have the most distinct difference between the American line and the European line, if you look at present time. It's not something Trump have invented, but it's something that he have made very clear when Trump have sort of gone all the way to the most sort of direct enforcement of what is seen as the American sort of priorities in the Middle East. We're talking about moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which have been a bipartisan long-standing idea in America, but no president have dared to do it before Trump did. And when we saw the European reaction, and even before actually moved the embassy, the European Union unilaterally decided to acknowledge the state of Palestine. So from the European Parliament side and from a couple of European Union membership countries, there is a recognition of a state of Palestine. So you can say that is a very sort of, that's the two poles in this argument. One is to unilaterally recognize Palestine, the other one is to move the embassy to Jerusalem before there's a peace deal between the two parties. And that maybe sort of sums up sort of in its extreme terms how different Europe and the US is looking on the Middle East. You can put on top of that, especially the relationship to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and its close allies in the regions. America is a long-standing provider of military equipment and of bilateral aid to Saudi Arabia, where there in the European side have been a quite large tendency, I would say, to unilaterally give Saudi Arabia the responsibility of radical Islamism. There has been, if you look at the European Parliament reports on, for instance, terror financing, they mention only the GCC countries, the Gulf countries. There's no mention, for instance, of Iran. They're not put on equal footing when we're looking into terror financing. And there is a sort of a great weight and a great sort of emphasis on what is seen as the damaging influence of Saudi Arabia on Muslim diaspora in Europe, where there is actually no mentioning at any extent of the Iranian influence in the same region. Actually, I think it came to a point where the External Action Service, the official sort of foreign affairs service of the European Union, had one employee, senior employee, who stated that she was responsible for dealing with the Muslim Brotherhood, meaning being in communication with the Muslim Brotherhood, which from the American side is seen as an Iranian sponsor of radicalism in the world, Egypt and Europe, but from the European side is seen more as a legitimate political actor. You also see it how we define the different terror organizations on the lists. Europe and the US don't necessarily agree who is your freedom fighters and who is your terrorist in the Middle East. I think there's as I said, a lot of different reasons behind this. I think one reason is that Europe likes to show the world that we stand alone, that we have our own opinions. And sometimes it have a little bit the character, especially in the European Parliament and in the External Action Service, that there is a certain tendency to say whatever America does in the Middle East, we sort of tend to swing towards the opposite, to show how independent-minded we are. And maybe the best way to show that reaction was when we saw the so-called Arab Spring. Already the next day, Federica Mogherini was out celebrating this sort of outcry for freedom and democracy in the Middle East. She was actually going to Cairo and being in the streets of Cairo celebrating this event. When we, in the beginning of this year, saw uprising in Iran, there was, I think it was 9 or 10 days going by with no comments from Mogherini, and on the 10th day she said, we should urge both sides to refrain from violent activities, which was, at least if you look at the NGOs on the ground, maybe not representative of what the Iranian regime subjected the demonstrators to. There's probably quite a large agreement that most of the violence came from the regime towards the demonstrants and not the other way around. So there is clearly here a fundamental difference of opinion between the European Union and the US. And that existed already, as I said, before Trump became president, but that had been much more in the spotlight after he became president because of the actions and decisions he has taken in the Middle East. So it had more exposed that difference, in my opinion, than it actually created new differences. These differences are quite fundamental and long-standing, and we also see it in an area such as the Iranian nuclear deal, where it is from the American side, also to a large extent bilaterally not well liked, let's put it in that way. It's never ratified by the House because any president knew it could never get ratified by the House, so it's a presidential decree. On the European side, there have been sort of a great emphasis on keeping the deal and that the deal is good and efficient. So that's basically where we are more or less standing when we are seeing from a European and American perspective into the Middle East. And what does that mean in the current situation? My argument would be that it means a great amount of uncertainty and not activity, in the sense that there is no proactive measures being taken, because there is no real agreement. And after the Americans got fed up with the Iraq war, and probably also the Afghan war, but the Iraq war for this purpose, there doesn't seem to be any will in the American people or policy to make on-the-ground military interventions in the Middle East. And there's certainly no European appetite on the ground military interventions either. Which means that since the Iraq war, the military actions done by the West in the region, and for the sake of argument here I include Libya and Syria, has been in Syria for the most part inactivity. We have seen a situation unfold, we have seen chemical weapons being used, we have seen slaughter on a massive scale, and sectarian violence in all directions, but there had not really been any real American or European intervention in that. There have been Russian intervention, there have been Iranian intervention, there have been Israeli intervention, but the European intervention has sort of limited itself to some military special forces and advisors that have helped what we see as credible people on the ground, which have hugely been made more difficult with that many of these people that we have identified have been of Kurdish sort of ethnicity, which means that it brings us on collision course with our NATO ally of Turkey. And you can say to a large extent the same thing happened, unfolded with Libya. It was an air bombardment to sort of free the Libyan population. And since then we have seen the creation of a de facto failed state in Northern Africa that have a direct influence on especially Italy. I think when we are here we can just as well mention that has also had direct ramifications to Europe. That puts us, in my opinion, politically speaking, in a very bad place. Because where, for the American side, the Middle East is somewhere that they are very closely engaged, there is not necessarily a direct consequence of their actions in the Middle East. Where on the European side, there is a direct consequence of actions. So if there is a war in Iraq, we receive Iraqi refugees. If there is a civil war in Syria and we don't stop it, we receive Syrian refugees. If there is a failed state in Libya, we receive refugees from most of the world through that failed state, because there is no structures to sort of work with in that immediate neighborhood. And therefore I think that the European position here seems to be a little bit short-sighted, because our skin in the game when it comes to the Middle East is much more significant and directly impacts not only our international and foreign affairs policies of Europe, but also our domestic agendas. And I think we can see that with a lot of the agendas that have already happened in Europe and will happen in the future. And again, I think Italy is a quite clear example of that, together with a number of other European countries. So it puts us basically in a very, very difficult position, that we don't have any sort of real concrete ideas about our objectives in the Middle East. And I will sort of try to conclude with a walkthrough of what I have seen or experienced as the European approach to the Middle East in the time that I've served in the Foreign Affairs Committee in the European Parliament. And first, what strikes me first and foremost is Europe's incapability of making hard decisions. European foreign affairs policy is based on soft tools, and it's also oftentimes ridiculed for being a very soft approach. You know, I think the Americans sometimes have the idea that they can do all the heavy lifting and then they can come in with some foreign aid and try to clean up the mess afterwards. That has sort of roughly been the way many Americans have seen and understood the European approach to foreign affairs, and that also holds true in the Middle East. There has not been any. The only places where Europe has sort of intervened on our own has been in Mali and the Central African Republic. And I'm not going to dismiss the actions there, but they are relatively small scales operation and predominantly French operations, padded with some European affiliation. It reminds me a little bit of when Iceland had to participate in the Afghani war because they are a NATO member, but with no army. They had to create an army of one man. It was a police woman who was then made colonel in the Icelandic army, and then she was put to Afghanistan to liaison between the Icelandic army and the rest of the world coalition, which was a very interesting phenomenon. But they sent 100% of their army, and that commitment is commendable for our former colony in the Arctic. But anyway, it has sort of that character that it is sort of more or less a French mission, and some would also argue more or less in a French interest, as it's their former colonial ties and understanding in that part of Africa. The other thing that is, and that would sort of be my concluding remarks before we go to the Q&As, and I hope that I have been able to provoke you a little bit to come up with some good questions. That is the so-called value-based approach to foreign affairs that the European Union has opted into. And that, I think, everyone finds that commendable, that, you know, we should be guided by our principles and our values. But again, I think we come into the focal point here where theory and actions have a very difficult time lining up. Because it's very easy to have a value-based foreign affairs agenda towards countries that are either dependent on you or have a great interest of being friendly with you. It is much harder to impose such a line on people who have a hostile or dismissive attitude towards you. So let me exemplify that. In the time I've sat in the European Parliament since 2014, we have had 4 resolutions condemning the human rights situation in Egypt. I'm not saying that it's not warranted, that there is gross human rights violations in Egypt, but we have only had 1 against Iran and 1 against China. Respectively, the largest user of the death penalty per capita and the largest user of the penalty period. So there is not really any proportionality in what we focus on. You would also see that most of our resolutions goes on countries like Bahrain, now we're doing Yemen next week, and so on and so forth. But we're doing it primarily towards either quite small countries that doesn't really have any measures of fighting back in a diplomatic sense, or against countries who are very dependent on us, like a country like Egypt, that have a great dependency on foreign aid to stabilize the regime and the very big problems just feeding the population, the growing population in Egypt. It makes them dependent on European and American aid. So we have this tendency to put a label on our foreign affairs objectives that is labeled under the sort of title of value-based. But if we have sort of a more thorough academic research done on it, it's actually more opportune in the sense that we only keep to our values when it have little or no cost for us diplomatically or economically speaking. And that is also why you have seen no, for instance, loss from the European side to pair Iranian sanctions to the human rights violations of Iran. As an example, where you can say, again, contrary to Bahrain, where you had a very great interest in interfering directly in, for instance, concrete court cases in the Bahraini authorities or concrete individual cases of dual citizens who have been convicted for one or the other. But when you pair them up with, for instance, dual citizens of Iran, who is also, for instance, on death row in Iran, there is not at all the same appetite to go into those cases. And I think that gives Europe a little bit of a Hippocratic approach, and I think that's also detected in the region and making us a less credible actor, because we are not, as the Americans, driven by our national interest, but we claim to be driven by principles when it doesn't really hold up to a scrutiny, whether that is done on an equal basis. So that was hopefully relatively brief to the force in the Middle East and the ongoing conflicts. I'll say we have very good experts in this room, so they probably know much more about the details, but I'll try to answer any questions that you have, and I hope that, that at least we have provoked some academic discussion over the top. Thank you very much.
Can I start things off by being a devil's advocate? My name is Keith Boyfield. I'm a senior fellow of Eurogov Information Centre. What do you say to the accusation, criticism of the EU and NATO countries? I'm thinking of Germany, that has a non-functioning army, the United Kingdom, that has an aircraft carrier with no planes that can land or take off, when it comes to actually committing troops or armed services on the ground, we're empty blouse. What's your answer to that accusation? And doesn't that have an awful lot to do with Mr. Trump's view about NATO and Europe's commitment to actually spending some money and resources to NATO?
There's no doubt that regardless of who were elected president, actually also the former President Obama, had the view that Europe is staking the Americans with the bill for our common defense. And of course, the NATO defense is primarily a defense, meaning that the NATO article is only invoked if a country is actually attacked. Has only been invoked once, when 9/11 happened in the US. It was invoked as the sort of musketeer clause of the NATO agreement. But there's no doubt that many European countries, including my own, and I'll stop by criticizing only my own country, and then you can think about, if you come from other European countries, how it is in your countries, decided after the Cold War was over to buy into the idea that this was the end of history. Meaning now the liberal democracies had won. Now it's just a question about how expedient everyone came to understand that the way we have done it in North America and Europe, at that time Western Europe, was the only right way to govern and form a society. And that meant that old European NATO allies, especially from, I'll call them the old allies, meaning not the new Eastern and Central European allies, decided in Europe to cut down. Actually, for instance, from a Danish point of view, we have put out several reports from the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Defense saying that Russia is not a territorial threat to Europe, and therefore we don't need a territorial defense force. We only need an expeditionary force that could be sent out whenever we wanted to send out peacekeeping missions or hard military missions. There's been a lot of that going around. There's still a lot of that going around in Europe. Regardless of my feelings about Trump, there is a valid American argument that we are not living up to our obligations, military speaking. And there is also an argument to be made from the Americans, in my point of view, that if we have an alliance to go in somewhere, we need to share in the heavy lifting. Meaning that we cannot all just send troops to the least dangerous places. or to the sort of very more logistic functions of it. I think there is a realization of that in Eastern Europe, because they have a much more predominant feeling of threat from Russia, and therefore they have a much larger need for the Americans to understand that they are good allies. So you see that in Poland, in the Baltic countries. I would say you also see it a little bit in Denmark and Norway and the Netherlands. I think it's no coincidence that the two last General Secretaries of NATO have been a Norwegian and a Dane. That's because we, as very small countries, have gone places that are very dangerous. I don't know if it's because we are more stupid than the rest of Europe, since we go with the British, and the British go with dangerous places like Helmand in Afghanistan, Basra province in Iraq, and that's places where if you put infantry on the ground, you will have casualties. And in the Danish case, meaning casualties per capita higher than the US. So actually a quite high casualty rate in those instances. But it doesn't change the fact that NATO has been weakened significantly by European inactivity. And I think the greatest danger, like we can go into now, in my opinion, is to give the Americans the excuse to withdraw from their European security guarantees. And we can do that if we don't live up to our side of the agreement, and if we keep saying to the Americans we can fend for ourselves with our own European army. And just to put into perspective, this new PESCO initiative of an enforced military cooperation in Europe, there was a think tank in Brussels who calculated how long will it be before we can actually deploy troops to a massive scale operation like Iraq or Afghanistan. It will take 20 years of strategic investment in cooperation and military, buying military equipment before we have the capability to make a medium-sized sort of military invasion of a foreign territory. So there is a really real risk here that we are not really coming forward with our electorate about the European military capabilities, and unfortunately they are not impressive. Of course, you have countries who can stand alone in small-scale operations, primarily France and Britain. And then you have a big country like Germany that, for very good historical reasons, has decided not to be very active in the military scene, which is, I think, from a European perspective, very understandable, but is actually getting to be quite problematic. Like the richest country and the largest country in Europe still have a very difficult time getting out of the post-Second World War trauma that they had, sort of national identity trauma that they have been in ever since.
Can I ask one supplementary question?
We better get to students, but a short one.
What would be your reaction if Greece was to attack Turkey over some territorial dispute in Cyprus, as they are both NATO members? The easy questions first.
Yeah, of course. I think, in principle, as long as you are a NATO member and you are under attack, you have a fundamental right to be protected by the Musketeer Oath. Then you have a question that is starting to rise in some European circles with if Turkey continues on the current track that they have been on since, especially since the revolution, but also from the time that they enforced their new constitution. There is a debate whether Turkey can continue as a NATO member with the values they are showing, especially also because Turkey shut down Air Force base used in Syria by NATO allies to bomb against Daesh and ISIS, with American and Danish aircraft carriers flying live missions from that base, and they decided to close it in and cut off the supplies and power for that base. That is not the actions that we can expect from a NATO member. But as long as they are members, they have the right to protection, and if they are attacked, in principle, it is always the attacked party who will get the aid from the NATO countries.
In the framework of the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, how has America's policy shifted under Trump compared to Obama?
Fundamentally, I actually don't think Americans disagree that much about their affiliations in the Middle East. The difference between Obama and Trump is much more to do with style. Obama thought that there's this theory that American presidents either are doves or hawks. And Obama thought that he could revolutionize the Middle East and that democracy could spring out under all the rocks. And then I heard once an professor saying the problems with Americans is that they think that in every human being lays a small Thomas Jefferson who's just waiting to be let out, and then he would be sort of a fully fledged American Democrat, democratic, Western-oriented, freedom-loving person. I think that was an oversimplification in the Middle East. So in general, an oversimplification. Democracy is something that takes a long time to establish. I think that is shown in almost every place in the world where it has been established successfully. But that was sort of Obama's approach. When it comes to Saudi Arabia, there's no doubt that the Saudis think that Trump is a much more reliant ally than Obama. But fundamentally, what Trump have done in the Middle East, from my prism, is primarily that he have reiterated the alliances that America always has chosen to have in the Middle East. And the American argument with Saudi Arabia is, to a large extent, they might be bastards, but they are our bastards. Meaning, we can work with these people. If we ask them to look into terror financing, they might actually go to lengths to do that. Where if you talk to the Iranians, they will probably not. And that is sort of a lot of the sort of American thinking, that is that they see maybe not the Saudi society, but the Saudi leadership, the royal family, as a reliable ally. And this is one of the great paradoxes of this region, that many will say that Iran's Persian-dominated population is probably the most educated and most Western-thinking population in the Middle East, where Saudi Arabia probably have some of the most conservative Orthodox people living with them in their kingdom. But when you look at the leadership, it's reversed. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is considered by the Americans to be a reliable ally, and Iran is considered to be a sponsor of instability and terrorism, both in their own countries, in the region, and in the world. So that is one of the great paradoxes of the Middle East.
From the perspective of a European Parliament member, do you believe that the American hegemony or primacy has been dwindling, or perhaps on a course to weakening, or is it as strong as it has ever been?
Sorry, which aspect? I didn't get it. On privacy or piracy?
Primacy.
Yeah.
Hegemony.
Yeah. The problem is I'm Danish, so for us, privacy is not a big deal. We give the public, we give everything away to the state. We let them register everything on us.
No, primacy.
No, primacy. Sorry.
Yeah, primacy. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. In the region or in the? I'm not sure. Could you try to rephrase it?
Perhaps the American sort of perspective is that they're the world police, right? With the right to boss everyone around.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Okay. Oh sorry. Yeah. Sorry. I just needed to be pointed in the right direction.
Yeah.
I think the very simple analysis of this is that if the Western world, meaning sort of people who buy into the Western democracy and freedom rights and so on, if that should have any say in the wider world today, it can only be facilitated by the Americans, maybe aided by European allies if we want to do it. And that is the big thing that we in Europe have not really understood. Europe is, by all accounts, a failing continent in a long historical one. We don't give birth to any children. Our economical rise is, we have a very good living standard, but we're not on the rise when we're talking about the living standard. And we're not very unified in a European point of view. So if you look at the very long-term geopolitical scene, there's no doubt that China has probably already overtaken us in most areas and will be more and more, that is the rising superpower in the world. Then we can decide to do two things from a European perspective, if you ask me. We can say, we can for as long as possible stand with the Americans with their flaws and what they do wrong and what we don't like about them, and say, let's try to assert, at least into the world, some of the values that we believe in. Or we can say, oh, we had a good run, we had 500 years where we dominated the world, now we go on pension, we enjoy the retirement, and we hope for the best for the future. The problem for the European continent is that we are basically the grey gold of the world. We are basically an aging continent that has been declining ever since the First World War. Some countries have not really understood or accepted it yet, but we don't, in my opinion, have a significant role to play in the world. We of course still have some economical power that we can play around with, but that will be less and less as more of the economical growth in the world, structurally speaking, in let's say 50 years or 100 years perspective, will move to other places. So of course we can do what we can to slow this decline down, but it is inevitable. And the Americans are the only credible, not even in population, because they are only 350-something million people. They have already India and China being plus 1 billion, both of them. But at least in military and economical terms, being one large entity, and we can either follow the American lead or sit back and enjoy our relative wealth. That is basically sort of geopolitically speaking the options we have.
Sorry, I'm sick. So you touched on the fact that now you have like Saudi Arabia and certain countries that are coming to the table with Israel, but for decades and decades they've just been doing it behind closed doors. It's not like these relations are new. It's just they're becoming more open. So the fact that they're becoming more open, is you see a change that's actually going to stem from that? The fact that they're willing to say, oh, we might actually one day have relations, because again, largely everyone knows they already do and have for years.
Yeah, they have had sort of a coordinating understanding of their common interests. What I see as the new thing is that they are actively pursuing this as policy, and they are also doing it more and more openly. For Israel, it's very significant. For the rest of the world, it might sort of course, if you're pro-Israeli, it's good. But you know, if you don't really care about the Middle East, it's primarily a thing that's good for Israel, because it offers Israel a chance to break this perceived unity between the Arab states and to maybe even open up, if not peace deals, but at least on a technical level do some more stuff. Also, some good could come from it. There's talk about a pipeline, an Israeli, Egyptian, Cyprus, Southern Europe pipeline. Could be interesting from an energy perspective in Europe. There's talks about the C2C initiative that could be a good thing for the region, sort of generate economic growth and expansion. And there could be talks about opening up flights to some of the Gulf countries, which I think from an Israeli perspective would be quite interesting. For instance, if you could get to the major hubs in Dubai and stuff like that. But you know, if you're not really concerned in the Middle East, it might not be as significant. But it is, when we're talking about the openness of the alliance, something that is becoming more and more intensive.
So I come from Syria, and might not be a question. I'm just a bit more interested in what do you think, like after, I know how complicated it is in Syria, like the actors and how many actors are there and the funds and stuff, but I'm more interested in like what do you think, like how it would end, like if, do you see an end of this, like?
If I knew how to sort of end the Syrian situation in a good way, I'd probably have a much higher paid job somewhere. But the way I see it's heading right now is it seems like the government is getting at least controls over the areas that they are controlling, and together with their allies or people that they have aligned interest with are crushing down most of the opposition in the regions where there's still fighting going on. So what I would expect to happen is that the current regime would be able to hold on, maybe not to the entirety of the country, but to most of the country, and then they will probably be kept in place by common interests with Turkey and Iran. That would be my best guess as of now, because I don't see anyone who can prevent it from happening. Israel will quite clearly prevent the Iranians from having influence at their border region. So if the Israelis sees the Syrians, Israeli sees Iranian proxies sort of infiltrating the northern border of Israel, they will prevent it. There is a clear military objective of Israel to prevent that there is a direct link between Hezbollah and Iran, and they will do that militarily. But other than that, I don't see any military actors who are going to intervene in what's happening on the ground. So it will be, in my opinion, in the end, a negotiated sort of areas of interest between these regional powers that are taking place in this, and that is, of course, the Syrian government, as I said, Russia, Turkey, to a certain degree, might also be some Western countries who engage and try to help a couple of the groups that have been fighting with us. But as long as we don't have, as I said, boots on the ground, our negotiation position would be ridiculous. And the problem is that many of the groups that we have been that have been aided by the Western world would probably have colliding interests with Turkey primarily. So again, my money will not. I would say if you have been fighting with the Western world, you probably made the wrong bet in Syria. Unfortunately, I'm very unhappy about it, but I don't really see any political resolve in anything else. The most we can hope for is maybe some air intervention if there is some red lines crossed, for instance the chemical attacks. If they continue, the Americans might again send in some military capabilities from air, but it doesn't really change anything. Of course it's bad for the personnel that's hit by that, but it doesn't change the situation on the ground fundamentally. So I think that's the way it's heading, and it's a testament to the great debate we have had here in Europe, where you can say when we went into Iraq, there was a lot of criticism of that and our activism and should we really engage in this. And when we didn't do anything in Syria, we also saw that have consequences. And it maybe goes to show that when you are a politician that should make these decisions, there is no right choices. There is only trying to find the least bad choice. And I think in Syria, we didn't succeed in that. In Syria, we have fundamentally failed from the US and from Europe, but I don't see any political will to do any different by the states in the process. So I'm quite pessimistic. I'm sorry.
That's honestly not true.
One last question.
Are there students who want to ask questions? So I was a little bit struck by the way you talked of Europe and the United States as comparable foreign policy actors. For example, US views versus European views, European policy versus American policy. Does anything like a single European view or single European policy existed? So, talking of foreign policy, Europe means basically a group of national governments trying more or less to coordinate that policy. And I was wondering whether Europe's option for soft power, as you mentioned, is really an option or a necessity. So, since you are a member of the European Parliament and the EU Parliament Committee on Terrorism, I was wondering whether you can articulate a little bit more on what the role of your committee is, and not only in terms of engaging, gathering, sharing information, or proposing resolution, but actually of coordinating and directing the national policies that we do.
Yes, I can do that very briefly because foreign affairs is one of the few areas where the European Parliament has no legislative competences, so it's purely advisory. When I said the European point of view, I mean the point of view as taken by common decisions or by the European External Action Service. But you're completely right. I agree with you. There is no European view on foreign affairs. There is 28 national states that to a certain degree sometimes align, sometimes differentiate very much in their opinions. And European action is oftentimes the lowest common denominator, or at least what you can push the most unhappy parts of the decision to agree to. And that is also a fundamental problem, of course, with the idea of European foreign affairs as standing alone from the American one. That is that you can never get a really clear opinion from Europe, because basically I can't remember the last time Europe unilaterally agreed on a tough foreign affairs decision. So we didn't agree in Libya, we didn't agree in Syria, we didn't agree in Russia, against Russia, we didn't agree in Crimea, we don't agree in... Yeah, I could continue to go on. So basically, you're completely right. So when I'm talking about the European point of view, it is more the point of view as stipulated by European institutions, meaning the Council of Foreign Affairs Ministers, and more predominantly in this regard, the European External Action Service and the High Representative Mogherini. But thank you very much for taking the time on this sort of hot summer evening to listen to me here in Italy. I hope that you got something to take away from it, and thank you very much to both the co-arrangers of this meeting for letting me speak and provoke you a little bit. I hope that, that at least you found it interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vistisen, and thank you for sharing your views with us today, and thank you all for coming. We'll have more events coming up this semester and this academic year, so please follow our activities on our website, grad school Facebook page, and our YouTube channel, and I expect to see you here for the next event. Thank you so much.